The side door of Judge Collins' courtroom swung open, and Bailiff Rivera led a thin, gray-haired man in an orange jumpsuit toward the defense table, chains clinking with each shuffled step. The docket clerk's voice cut through the low murmur. State versus Thomas Edward Garrison, case number 47392. Tom swayed slightly as he reached the table, catching himself with cuffed hands against the worn wood. Judge Margaret Collins glanced at her monitor, already forming the standard lecture she'd given 100 times to homeless trespass cases, when something in the attached documents made her pause. DD 214, U.S. Army, 101st Airborne Division, MOS 91B, Silver Star, Purple Heart. Her eyes tracked to a scanned notation. Heroic Actions, A Shau Valley, March 1970. She looked over her reading glasses at the man in chains, then back at the screen, zooming in on the service dates and unit designation. Her throat tightened. This wasn't just another nuisance case. If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, we'd love to know where you're joining us from. Drop a comment below telling us your city or country. And if stories like this one about hidden courage and the cost of service matter to you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more true stories that honor veterans who too often go unnoticed. Now, let's continue. The courtroom carried the weight of routine that morning. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the third-floor chamber, casting harsh shadows across the scuffed wooden benches where 15 people waited their turns. The air smelled faintly of floor cleaner and the coffee someone had smuggled past security. An American flag and state flag flanked Judge Collins' elevated bench, their colors muted under the artificial light. The gallery held a mix of defendants in street clothes, 2 uniformed officers comparing notes, and a handful of family members who'd learned to bring paperwork and patience. Tom stood at the defense table between Sarah Kim, the assistant public defender who'd met him 10 minutes earlier in the holding cell, and the empty chair she'd gestured toward. His county-issued plastic sandals scraped against the floor tiles as he shifted weight off his left leg, where old shrapnel wounds sent sharp reminders up through his knee. The faint outline of dog tags pressed against his chest under the orange jumpsuit and grimy t-shirt he'd worn for 3 days. His hands, cuffed at the waist by a chain, bore long fingers marked with old burn scars on the right and small pitted shrapnel marks along the left forearm. Sarah leaned close, her voice barely above a whisper. "We'll plead not guilty for now and ask for release on recognizance. I'll try to get you diverted to Veterans Court if you're eligible. Just answer the judge's questions directly, okay?" Tom nodded once, pale blue eyes fixed on a spot somewhere past the bench. On the prosecution side, Assistant District Attorney Jason Miller tapped his tablet screen, scrolling through Tom's prior citations. Loitering outside a convenience store, open container, a failure to appear from 2 years back when he'd been sleeping rough near the interstate and missed the court date entirely. Miller had his recommendation ready. Time served plus 3 days, standard for repeat nuisance offenders who'd already spent a night in county lockup. But Judge Collins hadn't moved on to the standard questions. She sat perfectly still, one hand on her mouse, scrolling slowly through the scanned military records that someone in booking had attached to Tom's file when they processed his worn plastic bag of belongings. Tom Garrison hadn't always been the man shuffling into courtrooms in chains. In 1967, at 18 years old, he'd been Staff Sergeant Thomas Edward Garrison, combat medic with Company B, 1st Battalion, 327th Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division. His call sign was Doc Hawk, earned during his second month in country when his platoon sergeant noticed how Tom seemed to know where incoming fire would land before it hit. He'd angled toward likely danger while rounds were still cracking through the canopy. Medical bag already open, hands reaching for tourniquets and field dressings before the wounded hit the ground. Radio operators started calling him Hawk on the net, and it stuck. Doc Hawk became shorthand for the medic who somehow got there first. Between 1967 and 1972, Tom served 2 tours in Vietnam. In May 1969, his platoon got caught on a narrow ridge in the A Shau Valley under heavy mortar and machine gun fire. 9 men went down in the first 3 hours. The landing zone below was too hot for helicopters. Tom moved back and forth along 60 meters of slick, muddy trail under continuous fire, performing triage, applying tourniquets, improvising field dressings from torn shirts when supplies ran low. When a mortar round landed close, he threw himself over a younger private, catching shrapnel in his leg and side, then refused morphine so he could stay alert. By the time two Hueys managed a partial extraction using hoist lines through the canopy, all 9 wounded men had survived the first 24 hours because of his interventions. The action led to a Silver Star. 4 months later, a resupply helicopter crashed on approach to a fire support base near Hue. Despite secondary explosions and ammunition cooking off in the wreckage, Tom crawled inside the tilted fuselage in the dark, cut harness straps with his field knife, and dragged 2 crew members clear one by one. He kept pressure on a femoral bleed with his bare hand for 15 minutes until medevac arrived. The battalion surgeon later said one man would have bled out in under 2 minutes without Tom's intervention. Within his battalion, officers trusted his judgment about when to push for evacuation and when to hold position. Grunts trusted him because he traded his spot on early chopper lifts to stay with the last man out. After a Shau, a lieutenant reportedly said, "If Doc Hawk says move, you move. If he says stop, you stop. He's the reason half of you are still breathing." Tom carried a simple phrase through every patrol: leave no one behind. It was repeated often in training, drilled into medics and infantry alike, but became personal during his first contact in country, when a wounded soldier almost got abandoned during a chaotic extraction. Tom and another medic ran back under fire to carry the man to the helicopter. The phrase became his yardstick, the standard he measured himself against every time he moved toward gunfire instead of away from it. Then came March 18, 1970, in the foothills leading into the A Shau Valley. Tom's platoon had been sent on a 3-day recon patrol, tasked with monitoring a suspected infiltration route. About 30 men, with Tom as the sole medic. They'd established a hasty perimeter on a small saddle between 2 ridgelines late in the afternoon, planning to move again before last light. Tom remembered the sudden stillness first. The normal jungle noise of birds and insects seemed to drop off. He was kneeling next to Private First Class Michael Hanley, the 20-year-old radio operator everyone called Mickey, checking blistered feet and reminding him to change socks. Mickey was laughing about something from high school, saying, "When I get back, I'm gonna," when the world turned white-orange. An RPG slammed into a tree just beyond the perimeter. The blast knocked Tom onto his back, ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. Debris rained down, bark, dirt, metal fragments. For a second, he saw nothing but spinning light and dark shapes. Then the crack of AK-47 fire rolled in from the slope below, mixed with the heavier thumps of M60s answering back. He smelled wet earth and the sharp, chemical tang of burned explosives. Another RPG hit the opposite side of the saddle. Men were shouting, "Contact front! I'm hit! Hanley, get that 6 up!" Tom tasted dirt and the metallic flavor of blood from where he'd bitten his tongue. His chest hurt from the concussion, but his hands moved automatically to his aid bag, fingers running over bandages, morphine syrettes for kits. He crawled toward the nearest cry. A corporal lay on his side, blood pumping from a thigh wound. Tom slapped on a tourniquet, tightened until the flow slowed, shoved the man toward a tree root for cover. Bullets snapped into the trunks above them, throwing splinters. The air stank of gunpowder and sweat. He heard Mickey's voice cut off mid-sentence, replaced by a strangled grunt. When Tom looked up, the RTO was flat on his back, radio still on, antenna bent, a dark patch spreading across his chest. Tom crawled onto Mickey's chest under fire, tore open the shirt, sealed the sucking chest wound with plastic from a field dressing wrapper. He started in 4 in the crook of Mickey's arm, with shaking hands, trying to raise the legs, keep blood to the brain. He yelled for smoke to mark an LZ. Mickey's eyes tracked Tom for about 30 seconds, then fixed on a point over his shoulder. The breathing went shallow, then stopped. Tom felt for a carotid pulse with muddy fingers and kept his hand there too long, waiting for something that didn't come back. Before the medevac arrived 6 hours later, Sergeant William Morton died from shrapnel to the neck, PFC Luis Ramirez from multiple torso wounds, and Specialist John Pike bled out from stomach wounds despite everything Tom tried. For men killed, Tom refused evacuation until all the other wounded were hoisted out, staying in the perimeter under sporadic fire, rechecking bandages, adjusting fore rates. When the final helicopter came at dusk with gunships overhead, he supervised loading, making sure each wounded man had a tag with vital signs and injury notes. Only when no more casualties remained did he climb onto the bird, sitting on an ammo crate, holding Mickey's dog tags in his fist. The bodies of the Kia were in black bags at his feet. Drop a comment if you've ever known someone who struggled after coming home from service, or if you've experienced it yourself. Your stories matter more than you know. Now back to Tom. Back at the rear, Tom's sleep became fragmented. Nightmares came 3 or 4 times a week. Ambushes that never ended, helicopters that never arrived. He flinched at backfires and distant artillery. After discharge in 1972, flashbacks hit at unexpected triggers. Wet leaves in a park car exhaust outside a grocery store. Once in a movie theater, a war film trailer sent him bolting out, heart-pounding. He filed for VA benefits in 1973. The first psychiatrist had never deployed, asked textbook questions, wrote adjustment disorder on the chart after 20 minutes. Tom attended a few sessions, but felt he was explaining basic field realities to someone who didn't understand. Medications were prescribed at different times. Prozosine for nightmares that left him lightheaded, Zoloft that dulled his emotions until he felt like a husk and stopped after 6 weeks. VA schedules were backed up. He waited months between specialist appointments. Paperwork got lost. He married in 1975, had a daughter Emily in 1978. At first, he threw himself into work as an EMT, familiar tasks, clear purpose. Over time, exposure to bloody accidents without the context of war chipped at him. He drank more after shifts. Arguments at home increased. He startled when his daughter slammed a door. Once he shouted at her to get down when a neighbor set off fireworks. His wife grew tired of walking on eggshells. On the job, concentration slipped. He sometimes froze for a second too long. In 1986, after yelling at a coworker on a call, he was asked to resign. By the late 90s, after divorce and minimal contact with Emily, Tom bounced between warehouse jobs, security work, night janitor positions. Each job lasted a year or two before absences or irritability got him dismissed. October 12, 2009, 39 years after Mickey died, he received a notice that he was behind on rent again. A VA appeal for increased disability had been denied on a technicality. That afternoon, after a panic episode in a grocery store, he sat on his apartment floor and looked around at the unpaid bills and the empty space where family pictures might have been. He packed a small backpack, clothes, his dog tags, a folding knife, a notebook, a pen, a flashlight, and a battered brass compass he'd carried since Vietnam. He put his DD, 214, and VA letters into a plastic bag. He left his apartment keys on the kitchen counter and walked out. He spent the next 14 years sleeping under overpasses, surviving on church meals and day labor when his leg allowed it. VA disability checks went mostly to cheap motel rooms in bad weather and alcohol to numb everything. 3 months before this court appearance, he traveled 60 miles to this city after hearing that the VA hospital here had a better PTSD program. On the night of his arrest, it was cold and raining. He ducked into an office building lobby around 10 p.m., hoping to stay dry. Security guards ordered him out. When he hesitated, they called police. Officers, already frustrated from multiple calls that shift, insisted he move along. Tom's irritability escalated. He pulled his arm away when they grabbed it, and suddenly found himself on the ground in handcuffs, hearing the words trespass and resisting. Judge Collins looked up from her monitor, her brown eyes focusing on Tom with an intensity that made Bailiff Rivera shift his weight slightly. She removed her reading glasses, set them on the bench, and leaned forward. "Mr. Garrison," she said, her voice cutting through the ambient courtroom noise with courtroom-trained clarity, "did you serve in the United States Army?" Tom's head came up. His pale blue eyes met hers for the first time. "Yes, ma'am," he answered, his voice rough and low but controlled. She scrolled through another document on her screen, then looked back at him. "What unit?" The answer came without hesitation, delivered in the same tone he'd used to report to officers 5 decades earlier. "Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 327th Infantry, 101st Airborne Division, ma'am." Sarah Kim's head snapped up from her legal pad. That unit designation, 1st Battalion, 327th Infantry, triggered a memory from childhood, from a framed letter on her father's wall in their home. The letter that mentioned a medic. Jason Miller frowned, tapping back through his tablet as if he'd missed something in his case review. Rivera, standing near the side door, straightened imperceptibly, his own Army MP background, recognizing something in the way Tom had answered, precise, automatic, the kind of response that came from years of training. Judge Collins' face went completely still. She clicked through another screen, her hand pausing on the mouse. "And your military occupational specialty?" 91 Bravo, ma'am. Combat medic. The courtroom had gone quieter. Even the court reporter's keys had stopped their usual quiet clacking. Collins scrolled to the awards section of the DD 214, her lips pressing into a thin line as she read. Silver Star. Purple Heart with oak leaf cluster. Bronze Star. Her father had been a Vietnam veteran, one who'd rarely spoken about his service, but who'd attended every unit reunion until he died. She'd heard enough stories over the years to know what a Silver Star meant, what kind of actions earned it. "Counsel," she said, her voice carefully controlled, approached the bench. "What would you do in this situation if you were the judge or the prosecutor? Would you keep the standard sentence or look for another path? Comment below and let us know how you'd handle it." Now back to the story. Sarah and Jason stepped forward to the elevated bench, voices dropping to hushed tones barely audible beyond the barrier. Collins pointed her monitor, angling it slightly so they could see the scanned DD 214. "Were you aware of his service record?" she asked Jason. The prosecutor leaned in, eyes scanning the document, then shook his head slowly. "No, Your Honor. I only reviewed the criminal history and the current charges." Collins turned to Sarah. "Have you had time to discuss his background with your client?" Sarah glanced back at Tom, still standing at the defense table, hands cuffed, shoulders squared despite the orange jumpsuit and the limp that had become permanent. "Only briefly, Your Honor. He mentioned he was a veteran when I asked about housing options, but I hadn't seen the service record until now." Collins made a decision, one that departed from her usual tight schedule. "I'm calling a brief recess. Ms. Kim, I want you to get more specific information from Mr. Garrison about his military service. Mr. Miller, I'm going to ask Mr. Nguyen from the VA to join us." She gestured toward David Nguyen, the 33-year-old VA social worker who sat in the gallery every Veterans Treatment Court day, waiting to coordinate intakes. "I want his records verified before we proceed." 20 minutes later, in a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom, Sarah sat across from Tom at a metal table, her legal pad open, pen moving quickly across the page. David Nguyen stood near the door, his tablet ready, accessing VA databases through secure connection. "Mr. Garrison," Sarah said gently, "can you tell me the dates of your service?" 1967 to 1972, Tom answered. His voice carried that same rough quality, shaped by years of smoking and shouting over helicopter rotors. "2 tours. Second one got cut short." "The Silver Star," she continued, glancing at notes she'd taken from the scanned record. "What was that for?" Tom's jaw tightened. He looked down at his cuffed hands. "A Shau Valley. May 1969. Extraction under fire. 9 wounded. All survived the first day. And there was another action." She pressed gently, reading from the notation. "March 1970. Can you tell me about that one?" The silence stretched for several seconds. When Tom spoke again, his voice had dropped lower. "March 18th, not the 19th. Contact on a saddle between ridges. Forkia. PFC Michael Hanley. Sergeant William Morton. PFC Luis Ramirez. Specialist John Pike." The names came out with the same precision as the unit designation, each one carved into memory. Sarah's pen had stopped moving. She'd heard that date before, seen it written in her father's careful handwriting on the letter he kept framed in his study. March 1970. A Shau Valley area. A medic named Garrison. Collins reconvened court 30 minutes later with everyone back in their positions. The gallery had filled slightly. Word had spread through the courthouse during the recess, the way news always traveled through small networks of deputies and clerks. A few more people sat in the back benches now, though no one knew quite why they'd been told to see this if you can. Collins addressed the courtroom formally, her voice carrying the weight of someone about to depart from standard procedure. Mr. Garrison, you've confirmed your service with the 101st Airborne Division in Vietnam. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor. And you received the Silver Star for actions in May 1969 in the A Shau Valley? Tom hesitated, visibly uncomfortable with the attention, but answered, Yes, ma'am, for doing my job. Collins' face shifted, something between sorrow and recognition. She'd seen the verification from David Nguyen's tablet. Service-connected PTSD at 70% disability rating, documented homeless status, prior contact with VA outreach that had gone nowhere due to system backlogs and Tom's own inability to navigate the bureaucracy during episodes. She'd read the brief narrative attached to the Silver Star citation, the one that mentioned 9 wounded stabilized under continuous enemy fire, and the note about the March 1970 contact where his platoon had taken casualties. Her voice wavered slightly when she spoke again. We owe you more than this, she said, gesturing at the courtroom, the charges, the chains. It wasn't theatrical. It was a controlled reaction from someone who'd processed hundreds of cases but recognized a systemic failure when it stood in front of her in an orange jumpsuit. The gallery went completely silent. People who'd been checking phones looked up. Rivera stood straighter, his eyes on Tom, with something that looked like recognition between soldiers. Jason Miller set his tablet down, suddenly aware that his standard recommendation of 3 days jail time wasn't going to apply. Then Sarah Kim stood. Your Honor, may I address the court? Collins nodded. Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she picked up her phone, pulling up the photo her father had texted during the recess. Your Honor, my father is Kim Tae-sung. He served as an interpreter attached to U.S. forces in Vietnam. She took a breath. In March 1970, he was assigned to a patrol that came under heavy fire in the A Shau Valley area. He's kept a letter for 55 years, written by a captain thanking him and a medic for actions that saved multiple lives that day. She turned her phone toward the projection screen that the court tech hurriedly connected. The image appeared, yellowed paper, typed text, a signature at the bottom. Sarah's voice strengthened as she read excerpts. The letter states, on March 18th, during heavy contact, Specialist 5 Thomas E. Garrison, combat medic, and interpreter Kim moved under sustained enemy fire to treat and evacuate casualties. Spec 5 Garrison's actions directly resulted in the survival of 8 wounded personnel. Without his interventions, casualty count would have been significantly higher. She paused, throat tight. The letter notes that of 11 wounded that day, 8 survived to full recovery. My father was one of them. Tom's eyes were fixed on the table. His cuffed hand shook slightly. Sarah continued, her voice breaking now. Because of what Mr. Garrison did that day, my father lived to come home. He married my mother in 1975. They had 3 children. He worked as a translator and community liaison for 42 years. He has 6 grandchildren. She looked directly at Tom. Every birthday, every holiday, every moment of my life exists because you were there that day. The courtroom was utterly silent. No rustle of paper, no coughs, no shifting in seats. Rivera's eyes were glassy. One of the officers in the gallery wiped his face quickly. Jason Miller sat frozen, pen in hand, staring at nothing. Tom's shoulders began to shake. He didn't make a sound, but tears ran down his weathered face, dripping onto the orange fabric. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I was just trying to get them out. Didn't feel like enough then. Still doesn't. Sarah's own tears spilled over. It was enough for my family. Collins had to pause, brushing her eyes with the back of her hand before she could continue. She looked at the faces in the gallery, people crying openly now, including court staff who'd seen countless cases, but never this. She pulled herself together with visible effort and addressed the courtroom. The charges before this court, misdemeanor trespass and resisting arrest, are not excused by Mr. Garrison's service. But his service, his documented PTSD, and his current circumstances must inform how this court responds. She turned to David Nguyen. Mr. Nguyen, what immediate resources can we provide? David stepped forward, speaking clearly. Your Honor, we can offer immediate placement in VA emergency housing, expedited enrollment in the PTSD treatment program at the VA hospital, and coordination with Veterans Treatment Court for supervised support. I can begin intake today. Collins nodded. Mr. Garrison, I'm transferring your case to Veterans Treatment Court. I'm staying any additional jail time pending your compliance with treatment and housing requirements. Mr. Nguyen will coordinate your immediate placement. She paused, then added formally, on behalf of this court, thank you for your service. It should have been acknowledged 40 years ago. It should have been supported properly when you came home. This is not enough, but it's a start. The bailiff approached Tom, unlocking the waist chain first, then the handcuffs. Tom stood there, hands free for the first time in 24 hours, dog tags visible now under his shirt where the jumpsuit collar had shifted. Rivera spoke quietly, soldier to soldier. Follow through on this, Sergeant. Take the help. Tom nodded once, unable to speak. The gallery remained standing as he was let out, not in chains this time, but toward the side door where David waited with intake paperwork and a ride to emergency housing. If this story has moved you so far, consider subscribing. We share true stories every week about service, sacrifice, and the long road home. Now let's see what happened in the weeks and months after that day in court. That evening, Tom sat across from David Nguyen in a small office at the VA hospital, signing forms with a hand that still trembled. David explained the plan in plain language. No bureaucratic jargon, just practical steps. A hotel voucher for tonight, paid through VA emergency funds. A medical evaluation tomorrow morning at 0800. Intake for the PTSD program starting next week. Tom listened, skeptical but too exhausted to argue. His backpack sat at his feet, the same one he'd carried for 14 years, containing everything he owned. A change of clothes, his brass compass, a folded piece of paper with phone numbers he'd never called. That night, he slept in a clean bed for the first time in months. He still jolted awake from nightmares. Mickey's face, the smell of burned explosives, the weight of body bags. But there was a roof, a locked door, and a schedule waiting for morning. Rivera, still in uniform after his shift, had walked him to the lobby before leaving. No grand gesture, just a brief nod and 4 words. Take the help, Sarge. 2 weeks later, Tom had a routine. Group therapy twice a week in a circle of folding chairs where 7 other veterans shared their own versions of what it meant to come home. Individual counseling once a week with a therapist who deployed to Iraq and actually understood when Tom said he couldn't handle crowds because his threat assessment never turned off. Medical appointments to adjust medications. A new combination that reduced nightmares without leaving him feeling like a ghost. Check-ins with David every few days, sometimes just 10 minutes to confirm he was still showing up. He'd moved from the hotel voucher to a small room in a transitional housing facility for veterans. Single bed, metal locker, shared bathroom down the hall. Physically, he looked slightly better. He'd shaved. Someone had cut his hair evenly. He wore donated jeans that fit and a clean t-shirt instead of the grimy one he'd slept in under the overpass. He walked with the same limp, but with a cane the VA Medical Center had provided, black, sturdy, with a rubber grip. He attended most sessions. He missed one due to anxiety when the group room felt too small, too crowded, and his heart had started racing. But instead of disappearing, he'd called David from the hallway, and they'd counted it as partial attendance. What was still hard? Fluorescent lights that reminded him of field hospitals, crowded spaces where he couldn't see exits, talking about Mickey without his throat closing up. Small victories, 2 weeks without alcohol, sitting through a fireworks simulation video during therapy with his heart pounding, but without bolting from the room, making eye contact with his therapist long enough to answer direct questions about March 1970. 6 months after that court appearance, Tom returned to Veterans Treatment Court for a status hearing. He wore clothes that fit properly. Jeans, a button-down shirt Sarah had helped him pick out at a thrift store, his old field jacket from the surplus store, but clean now, the frayed cuffs mended. He'd gained 20 pounds. His hair was neatly trimmed. His eyes, while still carrying the weight of everything he'd seen, were clearer. The dog tags still hung under his shirt, but his hands were steadier. He now lived in longer-term supportive housing, a studio apartment in a building reserved for veterans with on-site case management. Rent was subsidized, paid through a combination of his VA disability, finally adjusted to the correct rating, and a small stipend from a part-time job he'd started at the VA hospital, helping with maintenance and groundskeeping. For mornings a week, he raked leaves, fixed broken benches, cleared snow in winter. The physical work helped. He attended peer support groups and had started informally mentoring a younger Iraq veteran, Marcus, who struggled with nightmares and distrust of institutions. They'd met in group therapy. One day, Tom had noticed Marcus sitting alone afterward, staring at paperwork with the same overwhelmed expression Tom remembered from his own decades of trying to navigate systems. Tom had sat down across from him at the metal table in the common room and said, "You need help with that?" Now, once a week, they met in that same common room, and Tom walked Marcus through forms line by line. "You check this box. You attach this record. Don't let it sit. Follow up in 3 days." When Marcus missed an appointment or considered giving up, Tom showed up at his door. Not with speeches about duty or honor, just a simple statement: "I'm not leaving until you tell me what's wrong." The phrase, "leave no one behind," had shifted in Tom's mind. It still carried the weight of Vietnam, of Mickey and the others. But it included something else now, himself and the younger veterans who reminded him of the men he'd served with. If he disappeared again, went back to the overpass, he'd be leaving them behind the way he'd always feared leaving his men. He still had rough nights. Some mornings he woke convinced he was back under the bridge and had to look around the small studio apartment to reorient himself. There were setbacks, an argument with another resident about noise, a week where he'd considered walking away from all of it. But he kept his court appointments, his therapy sessions, his medication schedule. On this hearing day, Judge Collins reviewed his progress report from David, noting attendance percentages, housing stability, medical compliance. She looked at Tom, standing at the defense table, the same table where he'd stood in chains 6 months earlier, and nodded slowly. "Mr. Garrison, you've completed Phase 1 of Veterans Treatment Court successfully. Your charges are being dismissed. Keep working with Mr. Nguyen and your treatment team." Tom managed a quiet, "Thank you, Your Honor." As court adjourned, he left through the main doors instead of the side holding cell entrance, David walking beside him toward the VA shuttle stop outside. The same man who'd once shuffled in wearing chains now walked out with a folder of appointment cards and a plan. He wasn't healed completely, didn't expect to be, but he wasn't alone anymore, and that made the difference between surviving and actually living. Tom Garrison's story reminds us that the people we pass on the street often carry histories we'll never see on the surface. Records, not just appearances, told the truth in that courtroom, and a system built for punishment made room for repair. If you'd like to hear more true stories that honor service and shine a light on what comes after, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you know a veteran who's struggling, share this video with them. Sometimes recognition is the first step toward recovery. Thank you for watching.